Afternoon, everybody. So my name is Steve Chess, as John said. I'm the media director at ISBA, the Advertising Association of the UK, representing advertisers. And briefly before passing to Sam, I just want to give you just literally a couple of minutes context of this study. So this is something we've been working on for 2 years now. And it came out of an idea session, a typical kind of top-down, bottom-up session, end-of-year planning. Media transparency, media supply chains were of keen interest and always are to our members. And when trying to nail down specific projects, specific areas which would add value and would give them the most insights, our members really quickly settled on the idea of programmatic supply chain transparency. Lots more knowledge over the last few years about how programmatic works, and indeed most work very closely with the people that took part in this study, and the majority of our members with their agencies very closely in terms of the programmatic buying, as I'm sure they do in Australia as well. But still a bit of a misunderstanding. I still wanted more clarity in terms of who's in their supply chain and what value do they offer, and then trying to work out essentially if you can actually understand who they are, what's their cost, and then actually which ones drive value and which ones drive the most effectiveness. So we want to answer that question. We want to try and build on industry work that had already been done, and many people will already be familiar with the World Federation of Advertisers study about 6 years ago now, all that time ago, 2014, which is a really important piece of work trying to actually identify how programmatic worked, but also had the seminal waterfall chart, which actually showed that 40 cents in every dollar landed with the publisher and 60 cents were supply chain costs. And I think for many that was quite a surprise. It wasn't the main focus of the report, but I think that became one of the key headlines. And what they did there is they then asked key players in the supply chain how much they charge for their services. We then moved on a couple of years later to our cousins in America, the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers, who then works with our cousins, also the ACA in Canada, the Canadian Advertising Association. To then, they went a little bit further, excuse me, and they then looked at a forensic study. So they followed the money, impression by impression, from the advertiser right the way through to the advertising exchange, but they couldn't go any further because they only had buy-side data. So it was a really important study, and they followed all the money all the way through. But that marketplace point, they then had to estimate the costs being taken out of the supply chain, and then how much money then landed with the publisher. And that showed a slightly improved situation of around 46, I think, to late 50s in terms of cents in the dollar landed with the publisher. So to build on these studies, and other publishers also who've tried to take the bull by the horns and have bought their own inventory. So as marketers, they bought their own inventory to see how much money then comes back over the fence. We wanted to then do the first end-to-end supply chain study. So to do this, we've very quickly focused on working with publishers. And to do that, we went through the Publishing Association in the UK, the Association of Online Publishers. You'll see their logo there in the bottom right-hand corner. And they garnered together 12 of their publishers to match the 15 advertisers that took part in the study from our point of view and from our side. So this is the first, and as Sam will go into more detail in a moment, the first end-to-end supply chain study of taking buy-side data from the advertiser and taking sell-side data from the publisher and then trying to connect the two together. So first approach to actually doing this, and again to remind you, this essentially was to focus on trying to follow the money through the supply chain, and then look at the cost of each player in the supply chain, and then trying to work out whether or not it is driving value in that supply chain. And as you'll see from the headlines here, there are some quite stark headlines, but I think the key learning from all the learnings in here is the time it took to access the data. So Sam will go into a bit more detail about the length of time it took to actually access the data, and that's what's the key learning from the entire study. You know, we started this 2 years ago from ideation, and then when working with PwC solidly, it took another 17 months to actually then start the work to actually then get into the data and getting this over the line. So before I hand over to Sam to go through the details, it's probably worth noting as a final point of view that this is the first time, again, we've done an end-to-end supply chain study of actually following the money, impression by impression through the supply chain. And it's almost inauditable, the industry at the moment, programmatic supply chain at the moment. So we've got a world-class auditor in the shape of PwC that we very quickly settled on, not only for their auditing and their auditing capabilities more broadly, but specifically in this area. And actually then focusing on supply chain transparency, having worked with companies the publishing side to try and follow the money from their side. So they've got distinct experience in this area. And having a dedicated team at PwC working on this for about 18 months, and then having a team at ISBA, albeit a small team at ISBA, continually focusing and driving this to get this over the line. It took 18 months of hard work working with PwC to get this over the line, and specifically 15 months of grind. So there needs to be reform, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, and there needs to be change in the industry. But I'll touch on that at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'll pass to Sam.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everybody. So what I'll do is I'll give a little bit of a headline overview, some of the key findings, and then I will kind of start to move on to the slide presentation, and we'll show you some of the findings on screen. Just to echo what Steve said, this is a genuine world first. So we succeeded in matching 31 million impressions from end to end. Previous studies of this sort had only ever been able to get us from advertiser as far as DSP, whereas we've been able to go right the way through to publisher. The team that we had working on this comprised, broadly 3 sets of skills. People like me, I come from an audit background, so I've had 20 years experience of auditing media owner and ad tech and martech businesses. We had data scientists who, a sophisticated team of data scientists who've worked in this area as well. And we had our programmatic specialists led by a gentleman called Paddy Turley, who spent 10 years in ad tech before joining PwC. So we had a kind of experienced team, and we had done this before on a much smaller scale. So we, a few years ago, a publisher in the UK bought their own ad inventory anonymously, identified some was missing, and we went in to perform an audit of their SSP, did the impression matching, and identified that money was missing. So we knew that the impression matching was feasible, and we budgeted more or less correctly how long that would take, and the subsequent data analysis. What we got completely wrong was the time it would take to actually obtain the data in the first place. So back last June, we had 15 advertisers, 12 publishers, and the 8 agency groups representing the 15 advertisers, all ready and wanting to share their data. It actually took another 9 months to get that data from the tech vendors, and that's due to a complex series of repermissioning, which we'll talk about more shortly. Once we obtained the data, the data formatting was hugely inconsistent. Everything from unclear data definitions, data taxonomies, data fields that were unclear or untitled, challenges with getting log level data, meaning sometimes we had to use aggregate data, differing retention policies, and so on. And this collectively leads to our first key recommendation from the study, which is that there's an urgent need for industry collaboration to drive standardization of data access and data formatting, because it's simply not feasible for this type of audit exercise to take 15 to 24 months every time the industry would like it done. Once we had that data, we were then able to identify the various cost elements in the supply chain, and what we learned was that for this study, roughly half of advertiser spend reaches the publishers, and that there is an amount of about 15% that is completely unattributable. That is, it can't be attributed to any identifiable known element in the supply chain, and that's what we've labeled the unknown delta. And that leads to our second recommendation from the study, which is that once the data access and data formatting issues are resolved, the industry should then come together to dig further into the unknown delta and drive that 15% downwards for the benefit of advertisers and publishers. It's worth emphasizing that this is very much the premium end of programmatic. So we are talking here about 15 of the most prestigious advertisers in the UK, 12 premium publishers, and the largest and highest profile tech vendors. And even within that universe, we only succeeded in matching 12% of the impressions due to poor data quality in the rest. So we are at the most premium end of the premium end of programmatic. Our study is therefore not likely to be representative of the unmatched impressions, which had lower data quality, and is certainly less likely to be representative of longer tail publishers and longer tail tech vendors. We don't have any evidence as to what would be happening in that longer tail, but we believe it's probably a safe assumption that publisher revenues would fall and the unknown delta would rise. Another area that we didn't touch on in this study in any detail was fraud, viewability, and brand safety. And that is because we were dealing here with an analysis of matched impressions. So if advertiser spend was diverted to a fraudulent website, fraudulent impression, fraudulent click, then that money would never have entered into the supply chains that we were looking at. And by definition, we wouldn't have a matched impression with one of our AOP publishers. So these are clearly important topics, but they're not directly picked up in our study. Although we do look at the costs of the tools designed to address those issues, because obviously they do form part of the supply chain. So study participants are listed here. As you can see, we have 15 advertisers, certainly 15 of the largest and most prestigious advertisers in the UK, many of them global. And you will see from the DSPs and the SSPs, we also had many of the main global players there too. We had Google represented on both sides as DV360 and Google Ad Manager. In terms of study challenges, the most critical things here were the data access and the data formatting. To try to bring the data access to life, when we went to the publishers and they had signed up, the message from many of those publishers was, we only have theoretical contractual rights to be asked for it. So we don't really know how to obtain it. Please could you go to the SSPs with our permission and ask to take it direct? When we got to the SSPs, they often said something like, our contract with the DSP only allows us to share that information with a publisher, and you're not a publisher, PwC, you are a publisher's representative, and therefore we need to obtain different permissioning from our DSPs. And hopefully you can already start to see how this multiplies, because each of those 6 study SSPs were asking for the data, we're asking for amended permissioning in slightly different form, with slightly different wording from each of their 5 DSPs in the study. So immediately you've got 30 sets of permissionings. Then the DSPs, many of them said, actually, we think that we need amended permissioning from our agency buyers, our agency customers. So that's then another sort of 30 times another 8 agencies, up to 240 permissioning chains. Some of those agencies felt they needed amended permissioning from their advertiser clients, at which point you've reached the other end of the chain that had wanted to share their data 9 months ago. So that's the first challenge, is around the permissioning and the access. I did also mention data formatting. We have some examples on the screen there. So for example, even something as basic as date formats are held in a different format by each of the different tech vendors. And those same challenges persist with everything you can think of in terms of data formatting. Hence the first key recommendation, the need for standardization in this area. In terms of the methodology, so the advertisers and the publishers volunteered to participate, and the study was funded by the advertisers. The DSPs and the SSPs were the results of the advertisers and publishers that were participating. So we asked each of them which ones they used the most, and we aimed to cover about 80% of programmatic purchases between these advertisers and publishers. We matched over 31 million impressions across 290 distinct supply chains. A distinct supply chain is any individual route that an impression and cash flows from a single advertiser to a single publisher. I mentioned in the introduction, we only succeeded in matching 12% of impressions due to low data quality. What we did do was set a really high bar for declaring an impression match. So we were using fields such as obviously the advertiser, agency, DSP, SSP, publisher were all important fields in this. We also referred to device type being another one, date, time of day, ideally to the nanosecond if it was log level data. Where we could match log to log, i.e. single impression to single impression, we did. We also have some examples of one side or the other or both being an aggregate match. We only declared an aggregate match where they were very clearly the same impressions. So for example, if you had 4 impressions served by advertiser X to publisher Y on a single day, and both sides were showing 4 impressions, then we declared that a safe match. If one side had been declaring, for example, 5 or 6 impressions, we don't know which 4 of the 5 or 6 are the right match, so we would not have called them a match. So in summary, we set a high bar for matching, for impression matching, but what it does mean is that we're very confident in the data that results from our analysis. We'll move in a second onto the waterfall, where we'll talk through each element in detail. It's important to note that our waterfall is supply chain weighted rather than impression weighted. So what we didn't want to do was give undue weighting to any particular advertiser or publisher where we'd succeeded in matching more of their impressions due to better data quality. So what that meant is that every supply chain we matched was given equal weighting for the core waterfall. Sometimes then when we provide data back to individual advertisers or publishers, that is done on an impression weighted basis so that they know more about their specific actual results. Final thought, which would also be very relevant for you in Australia. So this was a UK study. So our work was being conducted on GBP transactions, but the programmatic ecosystem is set up to operate and clear and settle in USD. So you do get a lot of translating from GBP to USD and back again. So we'll move on to the waterfall. So what we have here is gross advertiser spend. That would include all those aspects that you can see where advertiser spend would go within the waterfall. Agency fees, probably the most notable sort of conclusion here is that there is a wide variety of different agency models, from fixed fee to commission to others. We tried to convert these as best we could into a comparable cost per impression, or an effective sort of CPM cost, to help build the waterfall. But this was never designed to be an exercise in benchmarking agency fees and services because of the wide variety of services and fee models out there. So this is purely to build the waterfall. This is not a benchmarking exercise. That could be done far more easily just by looking at advertisers' contracts with agencies, not building a full waterfall. When it comes to DSP fees and tech fees, I'll refer to these more on the next couple of slides. Probably the key point to note here is that tech fees includes ad serving, includes tools to address fraud, viewability and brand safety, and it also includes the overlay of any third-party audience data. Come back to the unknown delta in a few slides' time. SSP fees here, the most important point to note is that, like all of our waterfall, this is presented as a percentage of advertiser spend, whereas SSP actually contract with publishers and take a proportion of publisher revenue. That is obviously then based off a different denominator. So if you hear publishers talking about an SSP charge of about 13%, that is equivalent to the 8% you can see in our waterfall here. I'll now dig into some of the elements in a bit more detail. So first of all, technology fee. So as a reminder, this is a combination of the DSP fee and the tech fees. So ad serving, and then fraud, viewability, brand safety, and third-party audience data. What you can hopefully see here is that broadly the DSP fees and the ad server and verification fees, there is some variation, but it's not huge. The really significant variation arises from the use of third-party audience data. So instances 5, 6, and 10, very heavy users of third-party audience data. Instance 1 here, relying either on no audience data or solely on first-party audience data. Our message here is there's no right or wrong here, but if you are investing heavily in third-party audience data, you would want to be very confident that it generates a good return on investment. When we looked at SSP fees, interestingly, it did appear that SSP fees sometimes varied from contractual arrangements in terms of what we saw in the data. You have some like instance 19 on this chart where they matched perfectly. You had others such as instance 33 where there seemed to be some real variability. It's important to remember though that we are looking here only at single impression data. If you were on the matched impressions, if you were to look at, for example, results from a month or a quarter, it is possible that these items will be trued up through the use of reconciliations in terms of what the SSP actually invoices to the publisher. When we look at publisher revenue as a proportion of advertiser spend, the range was from sort of 49 to 67%. Broadly speaking, publisher strategies for programmatic fall into two categories. There is sort of camp one, if you like, who will have a relatively small number of SSPs that they try to manage more carefully. And camp two will have a large number of SSPs, hoping to plug into more sources of demand, but meaning it is harder to actively manage any one or two or three individual SSPs within that group. It's hard to draw specific conclusions, but there's certainly directionally, it does seem that publishers with fewer SSPs, better controlled, achieve a higher proportion of advertiser spend reaching them. We also did some analysis of display versus video, and a cautionary word here. We had 31 million matched impressions, of which 13 million were not labeled as display or video, so had to be discarded for the purposes of this slide. 18 million could be identified or were categorized as one or the other. 97% of them were display. So the proportion in the video chart by volume is quite small. That said, with that caveat, a greater proportion of advertiser revenue is reaching publishers for video impressions than display. This feels intuitively correct. Video has smaller inventory, fewer tech vendors, therefore simpler supply chains that appear to be better controlled. So we then did similar analysis for open versus private marketplace. Similar caveat that the volume of impressions that underpins the PMP chart is relatively small. It's only about 2 million. With that caveat, it does seem that a larger proportion of advertiser spend reaches premium publishers in private marketplace arrangements. We have had some people ask why the delta is not larger. Our hypothesis is that the open marketplace impressions here are the really high quality ones. They're the simplest supply chains with the most granular data that we've been able to match. And it might be reasonable to believe that if you moved from this most premium end of premium through to the unmatched impressions, through to longer tail, the OMP proportion of advertiser spend reaching publishers would decline, and so that gap would grow to the PMP figure. Now we come to the unknown delta. So what we have here is a box plot to illustrate the range and variability of the unknown delta. So as you can see here, the box represents the middle two quartiles, i.e. the middle 50% of impressions, and they ranged from 2 to 23%. Some impressions that we matched had an unknown delta as high as 85%. The average was 15. What the unknown delta represents is a discrepancy between the money that we can see in the data leaving the DSP and the money that we can see in the data entering the SSP. So it's a mismatch between the two types of tech vendor. The data in this study cannot tell us what the cause of that is. What we have done, obviously, is we do have some hypotheses. These are from a combination of our own industry knowledge, from other projects that we've done, and from our prior experience, particularly one of our team who spent 10 years in ad tech. We've also spoken to each of the tech vendors individually, and some of them helped identify causes, typically causes that they thought might apply elsewhere in their industry. And we have had discussions with sorry, 1 second. Sorry, and we have had discussions with individuals, knowledgeable individuals in the industry who we know or trust, typically on a sort of off the record basis. And we think the unknown delta, therefore, could reflect a combination of data limitations, meaning that we had to make occasional estimates. To give one example of that, a good SSP data set would comprise gross revenue coming into the SSP, less SSP fees equals net revenue to the publisher. However, one of the SSPs was only provided us with net revenue to the publisher. We therefore had to estimate their fees by reference to each of their contracts with the individual publishers, and then sort of gross that up to get back to gross revenue. Inevitably in that type of calculation, if there's a variation between what the SSP is actually charging versus what is in the contract, then that could feed the unknown delta. So there are some estimates, although I would say not many. Then there's the possibility of DSP or SSP fees that aren't visible in the study data. If there is other money being, other fees being applied that haven't been declared to us, then that would show up in the unknown delta. An example of that might be post-auction bid shading, where the winning bid is known, but as that money starts to flow, one of the tech vendors removes part of that spend. There might also be financing arrangements or trading deals between tech vendors and other parties in the supply chain. And if those sort of volume rebate type arrangements are being applied outside of the study data declared to us, that would feed the unknown delta. There is undoubtedly an element of foreign exchange. As I said at the start, there was a lot of translating from sterling to US dollars and back again. And depending on which rates you use and how many decimal places you round to, that can feed the delta. There might be elements of inventory reselling between tech vendors, which would drive the unknown delta. And there might be other factors that we simply haven't thought of. As I said in the introduction, the first critical recommendation of this study is the need to align data access and data formatting. That would then enable the industry collectively to dig in and reduce this unknown delta. Some other thoughts. We did look at the use of fraud viewability and brand safety tools. We believe, there are there are 7 main categories of these types of tools. A number of advertisers were using all 7. All of them were using at least some of them. Worth just pausing a second on the exclusion and inclusion lists. An inclusion list, often referred to as a whitelist, is a list of websites on which you have actively said you wish to appear. And if that was applied consistently, your ads would not appear anywhere else. 12 of the 15 advertisers were using inclusion lists. But the average number of websites used in the UK in the 3-month study period from 1st of January to March 2020 was still around 40,000. We haven't dug into the programmatic strategy that underpins that, but intuitively, 40,000 websites in a 3-month period in one country as an average does feel pretty high to us, particularly given that there were, in theory, inclusion lists being applied. So key recommendations from all of this, come back to the start. Need for urgent standardization of data access and data formatting. That would then enable investigation and hopefully reduction of the unknown delta. I appreciate that's been a huge amount of information in a short space of time. Very happy to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. So we have got a handful of questions. I will start off with those who've declared their names as opposed to anonymous, but we'll try and get through them all. I'm going to start off with one, and a heads up here, this is from an erudite journalist in the market, Mr. Paul McIntyre, and I'll read it verbatim. So the IAB Europe chief economist Daniel Knapp says, yes, the programmatic supply chain is murky, but the study mixes the methodological limitations and the results as if they were one and the same. Cardinal error that makes it only for sensationalism. The programmatic value chain needs to be held to account and many dynamics need calling out and fixing, but this study is overhyped, end of quote. Question, any thoughts on reservations around the methodology, or at least what the critics are saying about it? Perhaps, Sam, I'll start with you as you move to perhaps a different place in the house.
I had the sun shining right on my face there, which was unusually in the UK. So we've been really careful. The first thing I would say is we can't control the way in which the press reacts to the study. And I think if anybody reads the study report itself, they would see that there is no, I firmly believe there is no hyping or overclaiming within that. We have been highly rigorous in what we have declared to be an impression match. And we are therefore very confident in the analysis that comes out of that data. We've also been really careful to say in all our presentations that we don't believe this is representative of all of programmatic. All we've done here is match impressions for the most premium end of the premium part of programmatic. As an auditor or an analyst, I don't have any hard evidence of what's happening outside of this study universe of the 31 million matched impressions. What I would say is where we've matched the impressions, we had a series of briefings with the tech vendors where we showed them how the impression matching had been achieved. Each of those tech vendors had the chance to challenge us on what we'd done. And our team was able to consistently explain how we'd addressed each of those areas. By the end of each of those briefings, I firmly believe that the tech vendors were in a place where they were saying, okay, this does seem interesting. It does seem interesting that there's this discrepancy here. Can you send us some matched impressions so we can start to investigate ourselves? Ironically, the answer there is that we can't do that because a matched impression has both DSP and SSP side data. If we send that to an SSP to investigate, then they'll claim we've breached the DSP will say we've breached their NDA. If we send it to a DSP to investigate, the SSP will say we've breached their NDA. So you do come back to this sort of crazy permissioning where it is clearly in publisher and advertiser interest for everyone to come together and investigate. but the restrictions on the data use within the chain make that very, very hard. I think my answer, Daniel, would be we can't control the headlines. We've been clear that we don't think that this is necessarily representative. We are very confident in the findings within our universe of 31 million matched impressions.
Great, thanks for that one. Second question comes from Stephen Wright. The issues with data retention, taxonomies, T's and C's, etc., raise concerns in the area of data security, particularly for the banking and financial sector. Does this introduce new concerns that warrant extra consideration?
Steve, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, presumably this is in relation to then storage and transfer of data, as opposed to, is that?
I can only guess. There's no further clarification.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment specifically on the security, particularly of those players, the DSPs, SSPs, and others, in terms of how they store and transfer data, because this study just specifically didn't look at that. What we can say is that the length of time it took to get to the data. So I know that Sam has repeated this on a number of occasions, but I think just to put it in a different way, it took us, the reason, when going to the study originally, we decided to go to the advertisers and agencies to get the DSP data, and to the publishers to get the SSP data. So very simply, the contractual access to data is already part of the contract. Just go and grab the data, and PwC would then lift that data for them if they could. The issue came then with then going directly to the SSPs when the publisher said, actually, we don't have the tools or the people to go lift our own data. And the other side of the fence, the agencies generally very, very good about just saying giving access to the DSP data, and that was relatively straightforward. The length of time it took to get to the data, the 9 months to get to that data, and then when you get to that data, the data is not the same on both sides of the fence. So you've got different data fields named in different ways on the SSP and DSP side. So the amount of manual matching it took Sam and the team to actually then try and match the same thing. So if you imagine something that says country and one says geo, you've got to then do a direct match there. If you can imagine, you only have some data fields on one side, some data fields on the other side. When you get to the data, sometimes you have the granular data, the line by line, impression by impression data. On the other side of the fence, you just have the aggregated data, so maybe by hour, by day. So there just is no like-for-like comparison of data. And it's that which is one of the key findings of the study, that the format which the data is presented in and the data fields which you're then delivered as a client or as a publisher vary wildly. So it almost makes it impossible to have like-for-like data on both sides. So what we can say in the study is that there just needs to be like-for-like comparison on both sides. Really simple, line by line. Can I follow the money? Can I follow this impression right through the supply chain? It's that simple. And we realise that our view here is that this industry has been built on complexity rather than any Machiavellian reasons for obfuscation. This is just complexity, built on complexity, with no standardisation that's been brought to bear. And that's what needs to change to actually allow that line by line, impression by impression, follow the money right through the supply chain.
Great. This next question, Stephen, might actually be linked.
So can I just add something I should have clarified in my introduction? At no point were we asking for any GDPR sensitive data. We were very clear that we did not want to be given personally identifiable information, because then we would be at risk as well, because then we're responsible for it. So, these access delays should not have been driven by GDPR concerns, because we weren't asking for PII data.
Great, thanks for that clarification. So I guess following that same theme then, Steve, where in the supply chain did you experience most resistance or friction during your findings?
I think it was the permissioning side. So to be clear, on the buy side, we got the DSP data via the agency, and some of the clients that had their own contracts, their own DSP contracts, we could then go in and they managed them themselves. We could get the data from them. So that was relatively straightforward. But it's when we went to the publishing side and they said, actually, we don't have the tools, all the business intelligence tools to grab that data and then process it, but we don't have the people either. So it required PwC as an agent on behalf of the publisher to go and ask the SSPs, and the SSPs said, well, actually, contractually, we will only give access to that data to the publisher. So even though you're representative and you can prove you're representative PwC of the publisher, we need to then go and ask the DSP for permissions. So the DSPs then, if you can imagine going into this, you've got five DSPs, 6 SSPs. That's 30 layers of permissioning. You've then got 8 agencies, because some of the DSPs said, actually, we need the agencies in turn to give us permission. So you've got eight agencies, so you've got 240 combinations. So 5 SSPs, 6 DSPs. You've then got 30 combinations times by 8, the agencies, 240 different combinations. And then some of those agencies said, actually, we need the clients to give permission. So you have these, what we refer to almost doom loops. So the advertiser and the publishers both say, we want PwC as the agent to go and grab the data. The SSPs then say, PwC, you can't have access to that because our contracts don't allow for that. We need to ask the DSP for permission, who then asks the agency for permission, who then asks the client for permission. And it's that sort of doom looping of permissioning layer that took so long to get to the data. And in one case, we got some of the data, with a very final submission of the data at 6 o'clock in the evening on the final day. Bear in mind, we'd already delayed it 5 times. We pushed the study back 5 times. 9 months, literally right on the deadline. It took that long to get the data. So that's where we found the most challenge. This is not pointing fingers at any particular party, but it's rather that permissioning layer. It's the permissions and legal permissions between each party in the supply chain that we think have lost sight of the most important customers at the end of the supply chain here, which are the advertisers who buy it and the publishers who sell it.
Great. And look at the question, I think, from the perspective of a marketer here, based on the findings from the study, what is your advice to advertisers when it comes to programmatic advertising now?
So my advice to a brand would be twofold. First, this world is incredibly complicated, and we do see that the quality of agency programmatic teams varies. So if I was a brand, I would want the best quality agency team on my account, and I would be very willing to pay a premium for that. And then once I have that highest quality team in place, I'd be asking that agency to focus primarily on private marketplace arrangements with premium publishers, which drives down all of your risks. It drives down your risks around fraud, viewability, brand safety, as well as the sort of spend leakage that this study was concerned with. And I would also, as an advertiser, be, particularly if I'm an international advertiser, I would be looking to lean into the industry initiatives that will flow from this study, certainly in the UK and hopefully globally.
Steve, anything that you'll be saying to your members in the UK?
Yeah, I think increasingly a lot of members are looking at actually owning their own DSP contracts, owning their ad verifications, to be clear, viewability, brand safety, fraud. It doesn't mean to say they have to in-house all of that themselves, but they can still have their agency operate it. But by owning that, it means they have more control and ownership clearly of the data. So I think a lot of our brands and members are looking at that, and some have already transitioned. So I would definitely put that forward as consideration. We're still the agency operating it, but actually then owning the contracts yourself. And when you start to go into a little bit more detail, we had one agency group here who had all their clients on sort of one seat. So within that, it means that when they actually then operate then on behalf of their clients, they operate almost kind of as a group, if you will. So trying to separate that data is very difficult. So if we said, more particular clients say, can I have my data? It required then PwC to go to the agency, and then the agency themselves has to do quite a lot of work to separate out the client's data. And what I would suggest is that every client should have their own seat on the advertising exchange and should be set up individually within each agency. So it makes it much easier to get your data. And to be clear, this is log file data. This is really big, cumbersome data. It's not data you're going to be accessing every day necessarily yourself. But if you want somebody to act on your behalf to do the analysis, or indeed you in-house that eventually as a client, you want access and easy access to that data. So I suggest that if you're working with your agency, just make sure you're set up on your own individual seat, which means you can then get your data more easily. But I think in-housing those contracts should be a key consideration. And
do you see advertisers' contracts with their media agencies changing as a result of this? We haven't talked about the A word here, the audit word. Obviously, extremely difficult to execute right now. But do you see a future where the supply chain can move proactively to something that could be audited and to be a benefit for all?
So I would say I think there's probably there's three types of audit here that I think are important. What we've tried to do here is the end-to-end audit of the supply chain. We've proven it can be done, but we've also proven it takes nearly 2 years to do, which is not a sustainable model. So if you can move to a system where the data access and the data formatting is aligned, then the supply chain does become auditable, for those advertisers and publishers that want to share their data and have it audited. One key component of that would be a unique signifier for each impression that enables you to definitively trace an impression all the way through, rather than having to draw matches the way that we did. So there's that level of auditing. There is then publisher audits of their SSPs. So we spend a lot of time in this space in the UK, and in that time we've only ever had one publisher approach us to do an audit of an SSP. So we would certainly be suggesting that publishers need to update their contracts with their SSPs on at least an every other year, if not an annual basis, and exercise your right of audit at least every other year, if not annually. And then on the buy side, on the advertiser side, there's a concept of a digital process audit, which is going on site at your agency, using their systems to check that they're consistently well executing all of your campaigns in terms of campaign setup, optimization, reporting back to you. And what we consistently find is that agencies have a well-designed process, but they're not very good at applying it to every single campaign. So we see campaigns that start late, end late, under-optimized or over-optimized, incorrectly tagged, and so on. So there's a lot of elements that need to come together to really drive the effectiveness of programmatic.
Great. Guys, I'm going to say thank you very, very much for sharing your insights and excellent presentation with us this afternoon. Obviously, you have conducted a pivotal piece of work, which the whole industry, will move forward with, and I think also into a much more positive territory at the end of the day. So what does it all mean? What do we do here? And I just spend the last couple of minutes just talking about some thoughts from the AANA. Overall, we do support ISBA's call for standardization across contractual and technological areas so that we do deliver this greater transparency, and also the need for cross-industry collaboration to explain the unknown delta that we've heard so much about this afternoon. In Australia, this requires the AANA, the MFA, and the IAB to work together and define a work plan to deliver these outcomes for our marketplace. I think, quite frankly, we don't want to waste time debating whether the scale of the issues identified in this report exist in Australia or not. If they don't, then the task ahead will be a very simple one to complete. However, I think we all know that we must probably have very, very similar challenges ahead. The three bodies already have a great track record of collaboration. Collectively, we developed the ADAPs, the digital advertising practices, which are just about to see their second iteration. These are about best practices. We, at the time, didn't talk about standardization, but perhaps standardization now is something that does come into the loop. Whereas we obviously recognize the tough challenge, the target outcomes will only be to serve to build greater advertiser trust and confidence in the future potential of programmatic. This is obviously a big prize for the whole industry. The AANA Media Group sees clear roles and responsibilities within the collaboration. Let me start by saying we are not seeing this as a cost reduction exercise or an opportunity to put a squeeze on the supply chain. What we want is transparency and an understanding of value. That's it. We believe there are specific roles for all of us. The IAB can take the lead on transparency and the fluid flow of simplified data across the supply chain, define standards where they do not exist, and where they do exist, obviously implement them comprehensively. Our friends at the MFA, our media agencies, our media partners, can of course validate each of their clients' value chains, recognizing that each advertiser's arrangements are different. Our agencies are in the best position to serve the individual interests of their clients, clarifying every step of the respective supply chain. and at each stage detailing what it costs and the value it returns. This is a crucial relationship. And from the AANA's perspective, we need to drive better standards of understanding amongst marketers, and that remuneration for services requested and supplied needs to be fair and contributing to the value for everyone in the supply chain. Nobody says all this is going to be easy, least of all me. However, if we all subscribe to transparency in return for fair value, then the programmatic supply chain can undertake its next level of its evolution and grow through trust and confidence. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So I'd like to end by saying thank you very much to Sam and Steve for joining us from the UK today. Much appreciate you getting up early in the morning to do this. It does look like an uncharacteristically sunny day behind you, so I hope you get to enjoy some of it. To the rest of everyone tuning in this afternoon, thank you very much for your time, your questions, and hopefully you've walked away with some knowledge and indeed an ambition for change for the future. So thanks very much to everyone. Goodbye.